Billy hated school. He despised everything about it, from the moment he woke up to the moment he went to bed. School was a prison to him, a place where his creativity and freedom were stifled. He hated waking up early. The sound of the alarm clock was like a siren signaling the start of another dreadful day. He hated the homework, those endless assignments that seemed to have no purpose other than to make his life miserable. He hated the teachers who he felt were out to get him, always watching, always judging. Most of all, he hated the school lunches. The food was always cold, tasteless, and unappetizing. It was as if the cafeteria staff took pleasure in serving the worst meals possible. Every bite was a struggle, and he often found himself daydreaming about the delicious meals his mom made at home. He would do anything to get out of going. He spent his days staring out the window, imagining a world where he was free to do as he pleased. A world where he didn't have to sit in a stuffy classroom listening to boring lectures. One day, Billy decided to play hooky. He couldn't take it anymore. The thought of spending another day in that place was unbearable, so he waited until his parents were busy and snuck out his bedroom window. He hid in the woods all day, enjoying the peace and quiet, the chirping of the birds, the rustling of the leaves. It was all so soothing. For the first time in a long time, he felt free. He spent the day exploring, climbing trees, and just enjoying being a kid. But his freedom was short-lived. As the sun began to set, he realized he had to go home. He knew his parents would be worried, but he didn't care. He had tasted freedom, and he wanted more. His parents were furious when he got home. They had been worried sick, and their relief quickly turned to anger. They scolded him, grounding him for a month and taking away his privileges. They warned him, "If you ever skip school again, you'll regret it." But Billy didn't listen. He was defiant, convinced that he could outsmart them. He skipped school again and again. Each time he found new places to hide, new ways to avoid getting caught. He became an expert at sneaking out, always one step ahead of his parents and teachers. His parents were at their wits' end. They didn't know what to do. They had tried everything, from grounding him to taking away his favorite toys, but nothing seemed to work. Billy was determined to avoid school at all costs. They argued late into the night, trying to come up with a solution. They were exhausted, both physically and emotionally. They loved their son, but they couldn't understand why he hated school so much. Until one day they heard about a special house, a place that promised to help boys like Billy. They were skeptical at first, but they were desperate. They decided to give it a try. The house was old and creepy, with an air of mystery about it. It was known as the House for Disobedient Boys, a place where kids learned their lesson, where they were taught to respect authority and follow the rules. The stories about the house were enough to send shivers down anyone's spine. It was said that the house was haunted, that the spirits of disobedient boys roamed the halls, forever trapped in their own personal hell. Billy was terrified. The thought of being sent to that place was enough to make him reconsider his actions. But deep down, he knew that if he didn't change his ways, he might end up there. And that was a place nobody ever wanted to go. The house stood alone on a hill, shrouded in fog. It was as if the mist itself was trying to hide the mansion from the world, to keep its secrets buried within the dense, swirling vapor. It was a dark and imposing Victorian mansion with crumbling stone walls and boarded-up windows. The once grand structure now seemed to sag under the weight of its own history, each crack and crevice whispering tales of a bygone era. The iron gates creaked open as Billy's parents drove him up the long driveway. The sound echoed through the fog, a haunting reminder of the isolation that awaited them. His heart pounded in his chest. Each beat seemed louder than the last, reverberating through his small frame as he clutched his chest in fear. He had a bad feeling about this place. The house loomed over him, its dark windows like eyes watching his every move, and he couldn't shake the sense of dread that settled in his stomach. He wanted to go home, but it was too late. The car that had brought him here was already disappearing into the fog, leaving him feeling more alone than ever. He was trapped. The door in front of him seemed to grow taller, more imposing, as if it were a barrier between him and the outside world. A tall, gaunt man with piercing blue eyes greeted them at the door. His presence was as cold and unwelcoming as the house itself. "Welcome," he said, his voice a low growl that sent shivers down Billy's spine. The man's eyes seemed to bore into him, seeing more than just the surface. "I am Mr. Grimshaw, and this is your new home, William." The way he said Billy's full name made it sound like a sentence rather than a welcome. Mr. Grimshaw led Billy inside. Each step they took seemed to echo in the vast emptiness of the house, amplifying the sense of desolation. The house was dark and dusty. Shadows danced on the walls, cast by the flickering light of a single ancient chandelier that hung precariously from the ceiling. Cobwebs hung from every corner. They draped over the furniture like ghostly shrouds, adding to the eerie atmosphere. The air was thick with the smell of mildew. Billy shivered. The musty scent seemed to cling to his clothes, making it hard to breathe. He felt a cold hand on the back of his neck. It was as if the house itself was reaching out to him, trying to pull him into its dark embrace. Billy's breath caught in his throat, and he knew that this was just the beginning of his ordeal in this haunted place. Billy was shown to his room. It was a small, bare room with only a bed, a dresser, and a single window. The walls were damp and discolored, as if they were stained with tears. He unpacked his things, trying to ignore the feeling of dread that was creeping up on him. He heard a noise, a soft, scratching sound coming from the other side of the wall. He pressed his ear against the cold plaster. The scratching stopped. He pulled away, his heart racing. He tried to tell himself it was just a mouse, but deep down he knew it was something more, something sinister. That night, Billy lay awake in bed, unable to sleep. The house creaked and groaned around him like an old man struggling to breathe. He heard the wind howling outside, rattling the window panes. Then he heard it, footsteps, slow and heavy, coming down the hallway. They stopped outside his door. He held his breath, listening intently. Silence. He convinced himself he had imagined it. He closed his eyes, trying to relax. But just as he was drifting off to sleep, he heard it again. The doorknob slowly turned. Billy shot up in bed, his eyes wide with terror. The door creaked open. He waited, holding his breath, but there was no one there. He scrambled out of bed and slammed the door shut. He pushed the heavy dresser in front of it, barricading himself inside. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. He huddled under the covers, too scared to move. That's when he heard it. Laughter. A high-pitched, chilling laughter that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at the same time. It was the sound of children laughing, but it wasn't a happy sound. It was filled with malice and dread. The laughter echoed through the house, bouncing off the walls, seeping into his bones. The next morning, Billy woke up feeling dazed and confused. The room was dimly lit, with rays of sunlight struggling to penetrate the thick curtains. Dust particles floated in the air, creating an almost magical yet eerie atmosphere. Billy rubbed his eyes, trying to shake off the remnants of sleep and the unsettling feeling that had settled in his chest. He couldn't remember if the events of the previous night were real or just a bad dream. The shadows that danced on the walls seemed to whisper secrets, and the creaking floorboards echoed the uncertainty in his mind. Was it all just a figment of his imagination, or had something truly strange happened? Determined to find answers, he pushed the heavy dresser away from the door, its legs scraping against the wooden floor with a loud, grating sound. His heart pounded in his chest as he cautiously peeked out into the hallway. It was empty, the silence almost deafening. He left his room and began to explore the house. Each step he took was slow and deliberate, the old floorboards creaking under his weight. The house seemed to be frozen in time, with cobwebs hanging from the ceiling and dust covering every surface. He wanted to find other boys, but he was all alone. The loneliness weighed heavily on him, making the large, empty rooms feel even more vast and desolate. He called out, but his voice echoed back to him, the silence swallowing his words. He wandered from room to room, each one as dusty and abandoned as the last. The furniture was covered in white sheets, and the air was thick with the smell of neglect. It was as if the house had been forgotten by time, left to decay in solitude. He came to a door at the end of the hall. It was locked. The door was old and wooden, with intricate carvings that hinted at a past grandeur. The lock was rusty, and the handle looked like it hadn't been turned in years. He tried the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Frustration and curiosity gnawed at him. What could be behind this door? Why was it locked? He jiggled the handle again, but it remained stubbornly in place. He knelt down and peered through the keyhole. The metal was cold against his skin, and he had to squint to see through the tiny opening. His breath caught in his throat as he tried to make out what was on the other side. The room was dark, but he could make out the faint outline of something on the floor. The shadows played tricks on his eyes, but he was certain there was something there, something that didn't belong in an empty, abandoned house. It looked like a child's toy, an old, worn-out toy that seemed out of place in the eerie, abandoned room. Why was it there? Who had left it? Questions swirled in Billy's mind as he stood up, determined to uncover the secrets of the locked room and the mysterious house that held it.